is my great pleasure today to introduce Professor Farid Abdel-Nour. He's a professor of political theory at the Political Science Department at San Diego State University, where he's currently the chair, also core member of the Center for Islamic and Arabic Studies, which he had directed in several occasions, also directed the Charles Foster Institute on World Affairs in an honorary capacity. His interest in teaching and research are political theory and Middle East politics, particularly Israel-Palestinian relations, fields in which he's widely published. But what I want to say about Farid is that he addresses these issues in a deeply humanist and fair fashion. He brings history and politics under the light of political theory, making acute and nuanced distinctions among so much noise in order to understand what's most important. The tension around moral claims with others, with oneself, how we can live lives as humans and as responsible citizens, and with ourselves in the choices he made. Very early on, Farid, decades ago, showed me the importance of nuances. For him, it's not only an intellectual enterprise, but a personal purpose. It's my pleasure, Farid, to have you here.
Thank you, Mara. I appreciate the invitation. It is a pleasure to join you and the group. I look forward to our conversation.
So we have our first session of the Conversatory last week, which was also on Israel-Palestine, which created a little bit of a reaction, unexpectedly so, because this is a very charged, right, conflict and an issue. I forgot to say in the introduction that, you address these issues, head on, in humanism and fairness. So why don't we do that? In this conflict, there are contending narratives. And these are two narratives that without the other, they feel there's an unfairness to the way it is conveyed. And both narratives illuminate something and obscure something. And I wanted to ask you, in your view, how these narratives, perform and do that.
Yeah, it's a huge question, of course. So I'm thinking that maybe we will go back and forth on this. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's helpful to think about what narrative is and what narrative does and the types of narrative that I'm thinking about and I think you're asking me about. Mm-hmm. I think everybody's familiar with fictional narratives, right? Obviously, that's not what's on the table here. What's on the table here are narratives with which we can make sense of our lives and make sense of this conflict, right? So the question is, what are truthful narratives with which we can make sense of this conflict? When I say truthful narratives, I mean narratives that people tell with sincerity mm-hmm. and with accuracy, that they are being truthful, they're attending to historical facts, they're not manufacturing mythology. And what you're asking me about, Mara, is the fact that even when people speak sincerely and attend to historical evidence, they can tell narratives about this conflict that are essentially irreconcilable. And that's the difficulty, right? When I say that the narratives are irreconcilable, it doesn't mean that there is no hope. So if I jump to the conclusion of all this, and this I'm doing that before I say anything about any of the narratives involved, I would say one can only make sense of this conflict by making use of more than one narrative. you actually have to hold in your head two irreconcilable narratives at the same time. I don't think it's possible. Whatever sense you make of this conflict within one of the narratives that are prevalent will be deeply obscuring and will not allow you to make sense of it in a way that's sort of does justice. So I know this isn't really a direct answer to your question, but I just wanted to preface that.
So what are those two narratives, you know, in your view, and how do they illuminate, you know, something and obscure something? And I think that your interactability that you mentioned goes to, you know, the question of how can I recognize, right, the moral claim to existence of that who denies my moral claim to existence, right? And this goes, you know, both ways.
Yeah. I think one of the disappointments people may have in thinking about these narratives is that they are not, it's not going to be possible to think of them as symmetrical in a sense. They don't do identical things from opposite sides. If they did, it would be easier, right? The world is always more complicated than that. So let me begin with a narrative. Rather than speaking of a narrative that belongs to Jewish Israelis and a narrative that belongs to Palestinians, I would like to speak of two narratives more generally that tend to illuminate some of the concerns of more Jewish Israelis. One of them does, and the other one tends to illuminate more some of the concerns of Palestinians. So let me begin with the narrative that I think we can call the two nations, two peoples, two states, possibly narrative. So the narrative that this conflict is a conflict between two national groups fighting over a piece of territory is a narrative that is offered in good faith by people who want to see a resolution to this conflict. It goes something like this. Sometime after the Enlightenment, it became clear. So sometime after the late 18th century through the 19th century, it became clear to the Jewish communities of Europe that anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish sentiment, even before the term anti-Semitism was coined, anti-Jewish sentiment was not going to be disappearing just because feudalism had ended. And that gave the Jewish populations of Europe to start thinking about how they can deal with this challenge. One of the concepts that was in the air in the 19th century was the concept of nationhood. And it became possible then for some intellectuals within Jewish communities in Europe to think of the Jewish people as a nation. And in thinking of the Jewish people as a nation, they came to think of them as therefore a group. Without wanting to get too pedantic here, I'll give you a very brief definition of nationhood from Benedict Anderson that is helpful. For Benedict Anderson, a nation is an imagined community, imagined as limited and sovereign. We shouldn't get stuck on the term imagined because all communities are imagined, right? By imagined here, we mean a community of people who are not going to all meet one another. It's also imagined as limited and sovereign, meaning that it's not a community of the whole world. It's a community for a particular group of people. By sovereign, meaning that its emblem is going to be independence and self-determination. And statehood is the emblem of self-determination under this umbrella, under this framework. So the Zionist movement is a national movement that seeks self-determination for the Jewish people. And it seeks that self-determination through an attempt to establish a state. A state can only take place, it can only happen on a piece of land. it can't be a random piece of land. It has to be a land that has historical significance of some sort. The land of Palestine was that land. And the Zionist movement started the process of seeking the establishment of a Jewish state, first a Jewish homeland, then a Jewish state in Palestine.
Yes, as if I may interrupt, as John Oliver, you know, from the last week tonight would say, there's a lot to unpack there. But I just want to make one comment that, you know, Herzl also thought of Argentina as one possibility. So it was not attached to a particular land, even in the person who is, you know, pointed to be the initiator, founder of Zionism. And the second qualifier that we can discuss, you know, later on, is that this is the Zionism that actually crystallized, right? Because there were other trends before that were not posing, you know, a Jewish state, you know, among which, you know, homeland, you know, I know, you know, you may.
So I appreciate that, and of course, you know, Herzl essentially didn't get his way, right? Because his idea that you could just find any piece of land on which a Jewish state can be established was simply not acceptable to the delegates who came to the Zionist Congress that was called. But you are functioning on a different register from the one with which I'm functioning. I'm telling you a narrative. You are filling in many important details in that narrative. Of course, there will always be more important, very important details to fill in the narrative, but I'm trying to highlight the main features of a particular way of narrating the conflict. Mm-hmm. So in this narrative of the conflict, that it is a conflict of nationhood, there is an attempt to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. There is that, and that the people living in Palestine and the surrounding areas resisted this idea and rejected it. And that therefore it forced the Zionist movement to realize that goal through war rather than through other means. Mm-hmm. And that a state was established that becomes the emblem of Jewish nationhood. In this narrative, there is room to think that, well, in the establishment of that state, a group of people was left out, also a nation, the Palestinian nation, and they didn't get a state. Therefore, this is a conflict between two national groups. Only one of them got a state, and the other one didn't. And therefore, we have where this narrative heads towards is to say that therefore a resolution to this conflict is therefore both peoples having to somehow partition this land, each of them being able to realize their self-determination. It's a very fair-minded narrative, right? It's a narrative that acknowledges the nationhood of the Jewish people and the nationhood of the Palestinian people. What I'd like to highlight now is what this narrative obscures. This narrative makes it seem that the Palestinian population, which was the indigenous population of Palestine, at the time that the Zionist movement tried to establish a Jewish homeland and later a Jewish state there, which in the early part of the 20th century constituted 95% of the population. Mm-hmm. The Palestinian population, that indigenous population, it has a grievance against this movement, the Jewish national movement. Its grievance is not well captured by the idea that they were deprived of the possibility of establishing a state of their own as a nation. That doesn't capture their grievance.
Why?
That's not what they're upset about. Mm-hmm. That's not the core of the conflict.
We've talked about.
Sorry, yeah.
No, we've talked about it. So, I mean, this is the core, and it's a very, I mean, it's a very acute angle to present what it obscures. Go on, please.
What it obscures is that the threat and the danger that the Palestinian people experienced from Zionism was not merely a threat to their ability to establish, to the realization of their national identity. It was actually a much more primal threat. It was a threat to their literal physical existence. It was not, they thought, their leadership thought, and they wrote about that incessantly, that it was not going to be possible to establish a Jewish state in Palestine without destroying Palestinian society. That was their fear. What ended up happening is sadly precisely what they feared. So the Palestinian grievance is about whether Palestinian society that existed prior to 1948, which was a thriving society. It was a society of many cities, thriving cities, hundreds of villages, of people who were engaged with the world, whether that life, that concrete life, was going to have to be sacrificed for the sake of realizing the dream of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine. That's the Palestinian grievance. And that Palestinian grievance is not captured by the narrative that focuses on nationhood. Mm-hmm. Because even if the Palestinians in the 1930s and 40s had said, guess what? We don't even want to be a nation. We don't even want to have a state of our own, right? Let's just sit on our hands and do nothing. Let's change our minds about what we want for our future. If they had done that, they could have still not saved themselves if the program for establishing a Jewish state was going to go forward. I say this here. This expectation that the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine was going to cause the destruction of Palestine used to be something that Palestinian intellectuals and Palestinian political leaders would articulate. It wasn't always taken seriously because there was always the assumption, you know, it could have been done otherwise if you had only cooperated. Research that took place in the 1980s through the 1990s, after the Israeli archives of 1948 were opened, and many historians started to visit those archives, including one of the most important historians, Benny Morris. It became clear that the Zionist leadership in the 1930s and 40s had a clear understanding that, in fact, that's what it was going to take. They knew that, they were talking about that, and that they understood that a Jewish state in Palestine could not be established without displacing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. This now is part of the historical record. Now, when we speak about the establishment of the State of Israel, we cannot avoid the fact that this was a project that could have only been established at the expense of Palestinians. So I'm going to pause here because I think you might have some questions or concerns.
Yeah, I wanted to pause here because, you know, we went, you know, ahead. I wanted to ask you about, you know, the moral tensions that this brings about. And you know, wrote about this extensively in a few articles. But I want to go back to the other narrative. So we have the two parallel narratives, and then we continue.
Yes. So let me now tell the narrative, another narrative that one can tell. Another narrative that one can tell is that starting from the European arrival to the Americas, a mindset came into being in Europe about colonizing other parts of the world in order to take them over, in order to spread European influence in those parts of the world. That colonizing impulse came to a particular apex in the 19th century through the scramble for Africa. And it is in the 19th century that much of North Africa and the Middle East came to be under European colonial domination. So, for example, Algeria was one of the first to go in 1830, Tunisia in the 1880s, Egypt in the 1880s, all came under European colonial control. What was left of the old Ottoman Empire by the time of the beginning of World War I was a stub. So the narrative that one can tell is that Europe had designs to control the region of North Africa and what we call the Middle East, and that it succeeded in taking over big chunks of it over long periods of time. And that Britain and France in particular had designs over that eastern sliver of the Mediterranean. And that the Zionist movement, weak, not knowing how it could possibly realize that dream, decided to hitch its goals to the colonial designs of the great European powers. It decided to make the realization of its goal contingent on colonial expansion, British colonial expansion, hence the alliance with Britain. So that the story of this conflict is the story of European colonization. The people of Palestine, who were the Palestinian people, who were culturally Arabic speaking, overwhelmingly Muslim, with a very large Christian community and a significantly large Jewish community as well, who were also Arab and indigenous, who were distinct and different from the Jewish communities who were coming from Europe, experienced a colonial takeover. That colonial takeover was facilitated by Britain, the colonial power, which facilitated the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, primarily, of course, through the Balfour Declaration, and later through the Mandate period through the 1920s and 30s and 40s, and ultimately left the ground ready for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. And that Zionism is continuous with that colonizing impulse. So that Zionism is viewed as a colonizing movement that started with British colonial designs, separated from it to continue its own colonizing mission. And as happened to so many of the indigenous populations of the colonized peoples of the world, the indigenous population, the Palestinian indigenous population, was dispensable and was dispensed with because they were in the way of a colonial design. Hence their expulsion in 1948 and the destruction of their society. That narrative attends to a part, to the blind spot of the other narrative. But you will have noticed that it has its own blind spot.
So what would that blind spot is? Because with these two narratives, but there's also, I mean, we can discuss this once you address the obscurity of the colonial narrative, right? But, you know, Zionism or the need for the establishment, let's put it that way. I should need to qualify Zionism a lot. So the need and the legitimate, right, a need and aspiration comes out of centuries of anti-Semitism, and way before the Holocaust, by the way, right? But it came acute once, the othering of the Jews took that turn of events, to put it mildly. So let's go to the obscurity. And
so that's what it obscures. You identified the loophole, right? Which is kind of predictable. What the colonial narrative obscures is that even though it is true that the Zionist movement hitched its goals to the goals of the great colonial powers and pursued its goals using some of the same means, one does not understand that movement, one does not understand why that movement became appealing to so many people if one understands it only in this way. If one does not understand that the Zionist movement is not a regular colonial movement. It doesn't have a mother country, for example, right? It is a movement where the colonial impulse serves another purpose, a purpose that you identified, which is a purpose of finding a safe haven for a persecuted people. That's the blind spot of the colonial narrative.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I hope you will grant me that both of the narratives are illuminating. Neither of them can serve without the other. And that both are obscuring of something important, which takes me back to what I was saying earlier. I really do think to think about this conflict in a serious way, one probably has to hold both of those narratives in one's head at the same time. Something deeply important for both peoples is obscured by one over the other.
Could you restate then the two things that would be obscure? Because these narratives also carry with them some sort of inevitability, right? Beyond the agency of people. So what we're doing with both narratives, recognizing something for each people, but also obscuring for each people, what we're doing in the same movement is bringing violence, because when it is inevitable, all means justify the ends, and we may put other human beings as means and not ends. And that's already a huge moral issue on which you have written extensively. It's the core of your work. But second, it denies freedom, right? It denies the freedom of individuals saying, this is not the way that things should be. I mean, I'm putting it in very simple terms, right?
Yes. It might help to remind everybody what these two narratives are ultimately about. They're ultimately about, and this is something that I think we all have to face head on. We're all familiar with many ways of framing and narrating this conflict. There are many ways to narrate this conflict, many framings. Many of them will focus on different things. They'll focus on human rights in a narrow way. Some of them will focus on the occupation. Some of them will focus on security, on terrorism, etc. There's nothing illegitimate about any focus like that.
Mm-hmm.
It is just that when we talk about the conflict in these terms, and we miss what it's at core about. And I think you'll find when you remove all the surface stuff, the one thing that people who are engaged in this conflict are most concerned about and matters to them the most is whether it was a good idea to establish the state of Israel, whether all things considered, it was a worthy project, or whether it was a historical crime. That's the question. That's the question people truly disagree about. I don't know that one can answer that question definitively, of course, because as you can see, the two narratives answer it differently. However, at least getting clarity about what we truly are disagreeing about and what's entailed in the positions we take is healthy, I think.
Yes, you touched the neuralgic core, and this is the issue that you bring up in, now going back to the article that you wrote on Benny Morris, who's a historian who changed his view on his reading of what happened, and you use that, and you use, I'm saying use in the best possible way. I didn't mean it, in a bad way. But you use that example to illuminate moral issues of wider importance, right? Like the moral issues that are at the core as you presented here. And if you can tell a little bit about this conversion, but you basically distinguish like three commitments that I found really kind of illuminating. And you say that, in these three commitments, if you commit to two, you need to reject the third. I found it mathematically amazing, but no, honestly, I think it captures the core of the moral qualms and the kind of choices that we have to make collectively and individual to be able to sustain these moral choices. So if you can just speak to that.
Okay. I just want to give a little bit of background, which is related to a point I made earlier about the historical evidence that was unearthed in the 1980s and 90s. When I used to go to college, which was certainly not in the late 1980s and 90s, I was in graduate school at that time. I was in graduate school, I was not in college. When I was an undergraduate, all this stuff was not available. And a lot of the claims that one makes today with historical evidence were considered scandalous, right? There was a time in which one could say about the establishment of the State of Israel that you can be fully supportive of that project and at the same time be fully supportive of Palestinian rights. Because it was possible to think that it could have just been done in a way that did not, it happened that it led to the destruction of Palestinian society. There was no necessity to that.
Mm-hmm. It was an issue of war, but not of design.
Exactly, it was an issue of war, not design. And this is the difficulty that we are faced with after the late 1990s, is even if we think it's not a matter of design, there is an element of inevitability, that there seems to be a convergence in the evidence that at least the main characters in the drama, the leaders in this drama, recognize the inevitability of the destruction of Palestinian society in order to create a Jewish state in Palestine.
Because at that time, let me qualify. At that time, a Jewish state was related. I mean, you work in other article, the difference between the Jewish state and the Jewish identity, the state that was passed into law in 2018. Your article is before that, but I mean, it needed a demographic majority.
Yes.
And there was certainly Jewish presence in Palestine, but not a majority, even with the immigration, right?
Yes. So the 1930s, as you would find predictable, led to very, very large scale immigration from Germany and from Central Europe to Palestine, Jewish immigration to Palestine. And I think that the leadership of the mainstream Zionist movement at the time expected that that immigration was going to be at such a scale that it was going to make it possible to establish a Jewish majority state in a part of Palestine, if you just carve it up right. But the Peel Commission proposal in 1937 revealed that if you carve up Palestine in a way that creates, that takes into account where the Jewish population was concentrated, right? In order to obtain a Jewish majority, you would still have to expel hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. And that's when it clicked, that there was going to be large-scale displacement. The UN partition plan did not call for the displacement of Palestinians, but in the UN partition plan of 1947, 40% of the population of what was said to be the Jewish state was going to be Palestinian, which meant, because of the higher birth rate, it was going to be a matter of, it was a matter of a few years before Palestinians were going to be a majority in that state. There was no way to have a Jewish majority state in Palestine in any part, no matter how you carve it up, that would have been acceptable to the Jewish population, to the Zionist movement at the time, that was not going to cause very severe harm to Palestinians.
If I may, in what you're saying, which is, historically true, and then Khalidi also quotes Jabotinsky, acknowledging the inevitability of this transfer, displacement, expulsion, etc. What you're also saying, and this is the difficulty, and high emotions and high contentions that run into this conflict, is that before 37, it was not in the design of Zionism to expel the population either, right? Up to a certain point in the historical development, it was conceived as possible to have a Jewish state with a Jewish majority, yes, but without expulsion. But that proved not to be.
Yes, and that, now the question is whether that was wishful thinking, right? In a sense, the way that was possible to believe, because people have to live with themselves, right? People don't like to think that they're engaged in a project that's going to cause harm to others. People of good conscience don't do that, right? People of good conscience engage in a project that's not going to do harm to others. So some of this, I would think, wishful thinking, maybe slightly self-deceptive stories that leaders of the Zionist movement told themselves before the 1930s, was that somehow the Palestinians were going to leave of their own accord. Herzl, of course, envisaged that possibility, that somehow they would just leave. Somehow you could give them incentives to migrate. What they didn't consider also is, if the Palestinians didn't leave, that they would find themselves living as non-Jews in a state that identified itself as Jewish, and that therefore they would never be equal in that state. So that's the best case scenario, right? Before 1937.
Which makes me think to the grievance, that was obscure, is that if they would leave, they would also leave the thriving societies, the point that you mentioned at the very beginning. Anyways, it just crossed my mind. It was like an impromptu, sorry that they
would be saying, let us dissolve our society, let us dissolve ourselves to make it possible for other people to have a thriving state. That's what would have been expected of them. That's why I mentioned in one of my articles, they would have had to conceive of themselves as martyrs for the sake of the realization of the dream of others. So you asked me about the article on Benny Morris, so I will elaborate a little bit on that. Benny Morris, once he did his research by the late 1990s, came to the conclusion that the price of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine was going to be essentially the dissolution of Palestinian society. Faced with that, he had to choose. Do you think that the price is too high? And therefore, in retrospect, you say, this wasn't a good idea. I wish we hadn't done it. Or do you say, you know what? It was worth it. Somebody had to pay the price, and it's okay that they paid it. And to my moral chagrin, he decided to make the second choice. He decided, and he decided it because he is somebody who does not shy away from facing historical truths. I truly respect him as a historian, but not as a moral human being. I respect him as a historian, but I don't respect his moral sense. He looked at history unflinchingly. He had a commitment to the realization of self-determination for the Jewish people through the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. He believed in that strongly enough to say that meant a price. Palestinians had to pay the price. I'm sorry they did. Here we are. I wish we had made them pay more of it. We should have expelled all of them, not only some of them, because then we wouldn't have a problem today. That's his conclusion.
And in that, you know, in what you said, you have the three commitments, you know, mixed up. So if we can single them out,
okay.
So we understand
the historical.
why. Sorry, so we understand why, you know, you respect him as a historian, but not as a moral being, because it comes out of the tension between, you know, the three commitments, right?
So the commitments are to respecting what the historical evidence converges on today, which is that it wasn't possible to establish a Jewish state without serious harm to Palestinians. That's one piece. The second is thinking that Palestinians are worthy of equal respect. Palestinians are morally worthy. They're equal human beings. That's the second commitment. And the third commitment is the commitment to the idea of establishing to realizing the dream of Jewish self-determination by establishing a Jewish state in Palestine at the time. These are the three commitments. I think you can't have all three at the same time. One of them has to go. Any combination, you can't have the three. And so this is, admittedly, something that may be easier for me as somebody of Palestinian background to see and accept that these are incompatible. I think somebody who finds themselves committed to historical truth and also committed deeply to the ideal of Jewish self-determination as it took shape in the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine will have a tension to face. Because for me, I don't have a tension because I think that for me personally, the project of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine should not have been pursued once it became clear what its cost was.
And that's a very important qualifier, because you're not saying that it shouldn't have been pursued, punto, I mean, period, but that not when it became clear that other human beings were going to be treated as means as opposed to, you know, so a question related to this, I mean, you're saying that, you know, the founding of the Jewish state in those terms is at least suspect, if not, you know, morally wrong, right? Because it's putting other human beings as means, and we're talking from the point of view of moral theory. And I don't know whether we have like a lot of time to elaborate on that. But one point that you make in this particular article that I'm going to share with the audience after the talk is that you make a very, very, very important distinction. And that distinction is that questioning the legitimacy or the moral standing, to put it somehow, of the founding of the state does not bear, it's not that it doesn't bear consequences, but it's different. Let me put it in my terms. Like, it's different from the legitimacy of the state to exist. And
Yes.
that's critical because these two issues are usually conflated.
Mm-hmm.
Intentionally and intentionally. Can you elaborate on this distinction?
Yes, yeah, I'm glad you raised that because you're right. I think these two things are often conflated, and that's what makes people so afraid of looking at history truthfully. And so when I look at the conditions under which the states of the Americas today were established, I'm horrified. I do not find that the conditions under which the states of North and South America were established to be conditions I would ever condone. I condemn them and condemn them fully. Mm-hmm. That is not a complete answer to the question of whether I think that the existing states in North and South America today can have legitimacy or not.
Mm-hmm. The US is a clear example.
Yeah, I mean, and that's going to have to depend on what kinds of states they are. What standards do they live up to? Do they respect human rights? Do they treat everybody equally? That's where I would place their legitimacy. It doesn't hang on their founding. We cannot undo the past, but we should face it for what it is. Mm-hmm. And so something similar in the case of Israel is how I view it. I think Israel's legitimacy hangs on what Israel is and does today, and doesn't hang entirely on the conditions of its founding. In other words, the question is, what are the standards to which it lives up or fails to live up? That's where its legitimacy stands.
Mm-hmm. And I want to clarify, it's like you are thinking about this legitimacy, in terms of, principles that are in its founding that are also equality and democracy for all the people, is not, on tribal terms, right? I mean, this is where you are. You come from, treating all human beings as means in themselves and not as ends in themselves and not, as means. It has nothing to do with Jews or with anti-Semitism or with any kind of any tribal claim.
I mean, I think maybe you're asking me too big of a question now. You're asking me to elaborate what are the standards of legitimacy for any state that I would respect, yeah, etc. Maybe we can put that in brackets and you can bring somebody who is going to talk about that in general terms. I feel like simply making the distinction is important. For our conversation, making the distinction is important. For our conversation, recognizing that facing the past is not in the same breath calling for the destruction of what exists in the present. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's what's important to keep in mind.
Yes, that's key. And so in this light, I mean, you work about, you mentioned at the very beginning the intractability of the conflict and how the two narratives exclude one another, right, from two people, and their moral claims exclude one another. And you also mentioned, something that I mentioned in introducing to you, is that it is important to be able to live with ourselves individually and collectively, universally, or as a tribe, or whatever it is, with ourselves. So you propose, a kind of expansion of that moral understanding that each of the people have about themselves, Palestinians and Jewish, Israelis. How would that work? How would you expand the understanding so that each can accept the other without breaking its core, that is, while willing to live with yourself, right?
Yes.
Not an easy question, I know. But
it's not. And the answer is very unsatisfying, of course. The answer is
no. So
I will give it, but it's unsatisfying. It's I live in a state today in a country today that was ruled by a president who thought I am dirt. And who was elected by large segments of the population of the country. How do I live with my fellow citizens who are truly believing Trumpists, Trump supporters? With difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's probably going to take something of that nature for some Palestinians and some Jewish Israelis to live with one another, to essentially just put up with one another, knowing that their neighbor, the person who's, the person who is next door, thinks that they are nothing. It's hard. So here's what I think large segments of the Palestinian public and large segments of the Jewish Israeli public will probably over time be able to find a common narrative. But I think there will be large segments in these two populations who will not be able to find that common narrative. And what they're going to be divided over is what I said is the main division, which is whether it was a good idea, all things considered, that the state of Israel was established as it was established, or whether it was a historical crime.
That's unsolvable.
Exactly. So some of them are just going to have to live with one another like that,
Mm-hmm.
knowing that their neighbors think something as unbearable for them to believe as that, whichever side they are on.
Mm-hmm.
But I started with the negative. I started with the pessimism. But there is hope. And the hope is there are some things they can actually grant one another that will facilitate this living together, even though they might not be able to bridge this gap. There's some things they can grant one another. I think it should be very easy, and it is very easy, for Palestinians to grant that Jews are a nation with the right to self-determination.
Mm-hmm.
That
Mm-hmm.
Jews have a historical, deep, important historical and religious connection to the land of Israel-Palestine, to all of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that Jewish history has given, there is a uniqueness to Jewish history here in the context of Europe, especially, that there is a history of persecution that has disposed some of the organized groups within this community to feel the urgency of having a Jewish state. You can grant all that if you're Palestinian without having to also now reach the conclusion that therefore it was a good idea that the state of Israel was established at the expense of Palestinians. You can grant all that with qualifications. You can grant it by saying, I actually see all that, but I truly think that the price was too high and I can't believe that somebody thought I was worth sacrificing in order to achieve that.
Mm-hmm.
So they can stop short of making that conclusion. And on the other side, it should be possible for Jewish Israelis to recognize, and I think many would, that Palestinian people are a national group and that they too seek self-determination, that they are indigenous to all the land of Palestine, Israel, not only a part of it. Just as we can think of Jewish Israelis as also indigenous to all of the land. That they have a deep historical connection, that Palestinians have a deep historical connection to every part of this land. and religious connection as well, by the way. And thirdly, to acknowledge that the establishment of the state of Israel came at their expense. Jewish Israelis are free to withhold the judgment whether they are willing to say that that price was worth paying or not. They don't have to share what they think on that. They can suspend their judgment on that or keep it to themselves in a sense. In that, these acknowledgements are not nothing. And while they will not bring the two peoples to see eye to eye, although some of them will, I think these acknowledgements will suffice for some of them to be able to create a common story. There will be significant numbers among each that will not be able to. And it's okay for them to live the way I live with my Trumpist neighbors.
It would create like enough of an overlapping consensus. I know I'm pushing a little bit kind of the term, and I apologize for an expert in roles, right? But I'm using it more loosely, right? An overlapping consensus that can allow, you know, a majority, you know, to live together. But because we're seeing is that, you know, we're pandering to the two extremes, the extremes that see each other as an existential threat, right? And with a lot of elements to do that, right? You know, if you put security and equality, I mean, for a long time, it was land, you know, for security, peace for security, but it has kind of distilled or sedimented to be kind of security for equality. And they're going to be those extreme, but the more we work, you know, on this expanding the moral horizon short of the things that you shouldn't say in a cocktail party, right? In order for the party to continue. I mean, there are possible, you know, ways to move forward. So which ways do you see? I mean, you are familiar with the two-state, one space that we discussed, you know, last time, which is a very innovative way of conceiving the two states without territorial partition. So how do you see institutionally and potential political solutions once you have, you know, this moral expansion, so to speak?
It may surprise you that I'm almost indifferent to the institutions.
I'm not.
Okay.
Because I know you, but yes.
Because, and I think, let's go through the options here, right? Two-state, one secular democratic state, a binational state. These are the main ideas. A binational state, which is also in federation with Jordan and, you know, some other countries. Like, there are many options here. None of them is worth having if we do not at least have the minimum acknowledgements that I'm talking about.
I agree.
And I think it will make less difference than we think which of those options ultimately materializes, if in fact some of these acknowledgements are in place. The work now needs to be done on the level of, like, I hate to use such an old-fashioned term, but moral development. And that's not only for our siblings in Israel-Palestine, but also for ourselves in the diaspora. We ourselves need moral development. We ourselves in the diaspora have to stop being part of the problem and try to be part of the process whereby at least these minimal acknowledgements start to be in place. I look at somebody like Peter Beinart, and I am humbled and moved. Peter Beinart is somebody who is a true believing Zionist. But Peter Beinart has truly taken to heart the Palestinian story. He actually did the work. And I admire that. I think when I think of, on the other side, I think of Edward Said. Edward Said is somebody who was sort of a constant voice speaking in favor of Palestinian rights, etc. But he did the work to try to understand where Jewish Israelis were coming from, where the support for Zionism was coming from. He did not support it, he opposed it. But he opposed it from a point of view of actually understanding, genuinely trying to put himself in the shoes of others. That's the work that's needed.
Yes, I am. Yes, I am glad that you are bringing Peter Beinart up and his article last year in Jewish Currents, where he basically says, well, what I was saying up to now, you know, I'm reviewing, you know, my position on whether you agree with one binational state, which, by the way, is already binational sociologically, but not in the normative structures, right? Whether you agree with that or not, he's saying that, you know, democratic condition, you know, of Israel is at stake, being a committed Zionist to, you know, not only, you know, a Jewish state, but also to a Jewish state that it's a democratic state. And we're going to have tomorrow here the CEO of the New Israel Fund, you know, who's along the liberal understanding of the state of Israel, and whether that's possible or not is you know, is something we will discuss. So is there anything else? I want to open the floor to questions that I know there are many. Is there anything else you want to add to this, Farid?
Of course there is. There's so many things I want to add, but I think it's better to hear the questions and see if maybe I can add something in response to what's on people's minds rather than just randomly.
Thank you so much. So let me look at it's very difficult to look at the chat here like we used to. So I can't really see them. Oh, there we go. So Jay Reeve says, what about the narrative that is older and begins in biblical times, that the Jewish people were expelled from the Middle East and rightfully wanted to return to its original homeland? You address that, but if you want to say something else also, you address this. I was not looking at the chat. The narrative, Debbie Osowski says, the narrative of a colonizing movement ignores the fact of Jewish immigration to Palestine from the Russian empires in the 1880s and again in the early 900s, and immigration intent on settling the land totally independent from any colonization by European powers. So we have these two questions, and I encourage everyone to add more questions to the chat.
Do you want me to speak to these a little bit? So the biblical narrative, I mean, it's difficult to say something about it, right? Obviously, I am respectful of people who adhere to a particular religious doctrine and particular religious beliefs. In the modern world, we live in a world of a multiplicity of religious beliefs. Mm-hmm. And when one group's religious beliefs sort of are used as a justification to deprive another group of their rights, the group whose rights are being deprived is not convinced. is puzzled by why these religious beliefs can be used as a justification. I mean, I think, having said that, at the same time, I think the biblical narrative, whatever you think of it, whether some people take biblical narratives to be literal, some people take them to be more symbolic, that they teach lessons and don't actually tell historical stories. Either way, what matters is there are people in the world for whom this is important. And that's so in a sense, I feel like I address it by saying a historical and religious connection, right? That's all I need to know, is that there are people for whom this land is important, for whatever reason, right? It's something to do with their set of beliefs that I clearly don't share. But I respect the person, even though I don't share their belief, and therefore I respect the fact that they believe something that I'm not able to believe myself. Okay, so that's all I can say about the biblical narrative. Now, on the colonizing narrative, I think the corrective is good. It's a good corrective to the very brief, stylized version I gave. Of course, a more elaborate, a more detailed version of that narrative would account for these periods, right? Now, although to address this point made by the questioner about the colonization, the colonizing movement, settling the land coming from the Russian Empire, and in the first decade of the 20th century especially, it would be probably not 100% accurate to say that they were disconnected from colonial concerns, from the concerns of the great empires, because Herzl already reached out to the Ottoman Empire in an attempt to get on board with the Ottoman Empire in getting their support for the Jewish colonization and settlement in Palestine. It's not a European colonization, but it is an imperial presence that was at that time being felt by the indigenous populations of these Arabic-speaking lands to be foreign at that time, the Turkish-speaking Ottoman Empire. Also, while the early settlements of the 1880s led to a little bit of tension, right, with the Palestinian indigenous population, it wasn't a ton of tension. The tension did escalate much later. The tension escalated in the first decade and the second decade of the 20th century. There, it wasn't the colonization, it wasn't the colonial designs of the great powers that's part of the story. It's just the idea of colonizing from outside, somebody coming to colonize from outside and settle the land. That's part of the story. And there it was the goal of some of the Jewish settlements in Palestine at the time to establish an independent Jewish economy. They often purchased land from Palestinian landowners with the Palestinian peasants on it. In the early years, the Palestinian peasants were allowed to stay and continued to work the land. Because Palestine at the time did not have a private ownership in land, didn't have private ownership in land. That complicated the system. The Ottoman Empire hadn't yet privatized private ownership in land.
Interesting.
And so the peasants assumed that they were just part of the land. But once it became, once the Jewish settlers wanted to establish an independent Jewish economy, they wanted Jewish peasants, they wanted Jewish people working the land. So they evicted the Palestinian peasants. And that started to create what was called later and became much bigger problem in the 1920s, the Palestinian landless peasant problem. It was now Palestinian peasants being evicted because it was not going to fulfill the idea of establishing a complete Jewish society in Palestine if there weren't going to be Jewish workers and Jewish land workers. So that created tension. Now, all that can't be compressed in the narratives, but I think all of it can find its place in the narratives, and all of that is historically sort of, all this is, so the evidence that the questioner brings is of course correct. I don't think it presents a major challenge to either narrative.
And but what you just said, that is, that gives texture also to the need also on the Jewish side, to give texture to its own society. It needed from, the land worker all the way to the intellectual and the city dweller, so to speak. There is another question. I have a lot of questions, but I think that I asked a lot of my questions. I want to give people the chance to ask. So Richard Ivanhoe, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, do the same narratives, the narratives exist in the surrounding countries, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, etc., or do they have their own separate narratives regarding Palestine, Israel? And then a second one, again by Jay Reeves, reference to biblical times is not inherently a matter of religious belief. Part of the history that needs to be faced is the historical presence of the Jewish people in the Middle East before they were in Europe or Russia. It's something that you have acknowledged. So if you want to speak more to that, but the question by Richard Ivanhoe about the narratives, existing in Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, before Lebanon was partitioned at the time.
Yeah, I mean, look, something that maybe doesn't come as naturally to many people living in North America and Europe is the colonial lens and the post-colonial lens and the sort of decolonizing lens. It doesn't come as naturally. Peoples who have been colonized and have suffered from colonial oppression are sensitized to colonization and colonialism. So if you ask me what narrative prevails about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the surrounding Arab countries, I would say it's the colonial narrative, because that one rings true and seems relatable to their own experience, but it actually stretches beyond the Arabic-speaking countries. I think that's the narrative. Sometimes people are surprised why there is so much support for Palestinians, given they are a defeated, dispersed, dismembered society. Really, I mean, why does anybody support them? Why does anybody even talk to them? And I think it's because their cause is emblematic of something that so many peoples of the world have experienced: colonial oppression. And the colonial narrative serves to make their experience accessible to the people around them.
Yes, I would agree with that, and I would actually say that the kind of the chain of equivalences, right? This identification with Palestinian has gone, beyond colonial oppression, and I am not saying this in any bad way. To exemplify, as you put it, dispossession, oppression, inequality. There's a lot of projection in the cause, of Palestinians. And again, I'm not saying this in any bad way, but the colonial kind of frame has been also expanded. Let me see. If I any other question in the chat. So I don't have another question in the chat, but so then I want to ask you a question. You talk about, the relationship between, narrative and morality, which I think, is key. And the narrative has to start somewhere, right? So it's a key issue when and how, we start narrating, and whether, speaking now in moral terms, whether we're narrating towards the self or the kind, as Aaron would put it, to a tribe or to an imagined community, or whether we are narrating, you know, towards the world. I know I'm being very Arendtian here. I apologize for that.
Yeah,
I mean narratives are key, how we tell the story.
Of course.
And we don't need to accept, as you said before, 100% of what the other, you know, is saying, but up to a certain point that allows the two of us collectively to live with ourselves and live all together as human beings, right?
I mean, your question about narrative and morality is, of course, key and goes to the heart of something I have said, and you've read sort of in my writing about Benny Morris. Yes, it would be nice if we narrate only to an equal, if we only narrate of one another's as equals, and never accept a narrative that does not treat other human beings with whom we encounter and with whom we interact as fully equal to us.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah.
In a sense, a moral narrative, a narrative that lives up to the threshold, minimal threshold of morality would have to do that. Unfortunately, as a Palestinian, I feel I may have to accept something less from some of my fellow human beings if I want to live in the world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Because if I waited for people to treat me as an equal, I would have long secluded myself from my surroundings.
Mm-hmm. But that's a good way, because, you know, while aspiring to the universal that you basically aspire to when you put it in theoretical terms and in moral terms when you write and when you speak, I mean, you also politically, you know that with 80%, I'm sorry, I never put numbers, but just to give, you know, a sense, but with less than 100%, right, it is possible to have a desirable society, and that would be, you know, a good compromise solution. But there's no solution without compromise. The issue is that the compromise is the other as inferior, different, and unworthy of dignity, or if we relinquish some, right? I know it doesn't sound quite right.
Yeah,
but
no, you're right. So whatever the compromise is, it can't be on the basic dignity, equal dignity.
But that's, you know, for some also a contested, right? A contested term. And related to this, something that we have discussed in the past, because I don't know whether people do not have questions, or there are too many questions or comments that they don't want. Yeah, sure.
So if you're looking, can I just answer your second question? Because you asked me two questions and I only really began to engage one.
Okay, sorry.
You asked me about where and when does one start? Where do you start telling the story? It is very telling where you start to tell the story. And so this is in engagement with a question that was asked, but that you essentially said, you know, I've already answered, but, you know, and that's the question that was about the Jewish historic presence in the Middle East through the ages and from ancient times. And I think, so for example, if you start to tell the story of this conflict by, you could start by speaking, you think that the beginning of this conflict is to begin talking about the ancient Jewish presence in this land. Okay, that's a perfectly fair beginning point. It would be fair, a good beginning point, if the narrator continued and gave equal weight to every decade and every century in between. Unfortunately, what happens when the narrative is told to start in ancient biblical times is that it conveniently skips about 2,000 years. Whatever, I don't know I do not know what my ancestry is. I haven't done the genetic test thing, and I don't know that it'll tell me very much. I don't know what my ancestry is, and most Palestinians don't know what their ancestry is. We are a mix. The people who live in Palestine are made up, who lived in Palestine in the 19th century, shall we say, right? Are made up of whoever came through Palestine. And surely, some of us are descendants of ancient Jewish populations, because surely beyond the Jewish populations that were there, and many of them that came there through the centuries from different parts of the world and were there from the beginning, some probably converted to Christianity, and some probably converted to Islam. So in a sense, to deny the ancient Jewish presence in the land would be probably to deny one's own heritage. In a sense, one's own genetic background, probably. So where does one tell the story? Where does one begin to tell the story? You begin to tell the story based on what you think is the most important insight in the narrative you're telling. The narrator always makes decisions. I find if you're going to tell the story that is favorable to the Zionist movement, a story that will be credible to people who are secular and from multiple backgrounds, a story that ultimately is about Jewish national self-determination. I find that telling that story, starting sometime in the late 18th century and early 19th century, is a perfectly good beginning point, because it is a time that allows you to speak about the rise of the idea of nationhood. And yes, you can then go back and speak of a long history of discrimination and suffering in Europe, but the focus is the idea of nationhood. So you begin that story from there.
Because it's also the story that frames the conflict, right? The idea of the nation.
Yes.
So that's a good point. And also, I always think that you tell the story when it starts hurting you. And I'm not saying this in a bad way, because we're human beings and we do that. When do you start telling when there was something that happened? And I hope, that, we started to tell the story when it hurts, that it doesn't only hurt me and my imagined community, but that we expand the we, right? That community to start to tell the story with different viewpoints. Farid, it's been a pleasure. If you want to add something as a closing.
Thank you. I mean, the only thing I would add is we all should be alert to the idea of silencing the voices that are inconvenient for us to hear. And we can do that in multiple ways. We can do that by labeling them, all kinds of things. We can do that by dismissing them. We can do that by sort of downgrading their expertise or what they bring. We all need to be open to multiple voices, but the most important voices we need to be open to are voices that speak in good faith.
Yes, and I want to tell a personal story. I was not going to, but we met back in the day, 1 month after Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, right? And we were both devastated, and our group of people, we were all devastated for human reasons, basically, all of us. But it was the first time that I was first of all, that I met a Palestinian. I mean, I was coming right from Buenos Aires, and that humanized the story. And you told me the story, about your parents, and they had to leave. So I expanded my horizon because of you at the time. So thank you for that. And I hope, we can all do that with other people, and we multiply that. So thank you, Farid, and thank you, everyone. I invite all of you to join the discussion, session at 4. So we're gonna have a little break. And for those of you who cannot make a discussion session, tomorrow we're gonna have Daniel Sokach from the New Israel Fund, adding to the complexity of this issue. Farid, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Mara. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
And bye,
Thanks,
everybody.
everyone.